All right, so welcome everybody. I am Chris Newell. I am the Executive Director and Senior Partner to Wabanaki Nations for the Abbe Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine. And I am also the co-founder and Director of Education for the Agamal Educational Initiative. And I'm here with friends of mine, that have all worked around a tremendous project here called Dawnland. And we're going to be talking about some of, the impacts of settler colonialism and genocide in Native America, as well as kind of, pointing it down to real life experiences here in the Dawnland. I am currently not up in Wabanaki, which is the land of the Dawn. I am currently in Mashantucket, which is the homeland of the Mashantucket Pequot. So I'd like to acknowledge the homelands of the people that I am currently broadcasting from. And with that, we're going to go around and do a short introduction from each of us, and then have a welcoming song from Jennifer. So I believe, Adam, you're up next, right?
Dawn, do you want to jump in first before I go? I think you're still muted at the moment.
If you're able to turn your phone slightly, I think that might help reset your sideways for us. There you go. Let's do that.
Dawn, you're still muted.
I'm going to unmute Dawn. Sorry, for some reason, just the Zoom was not happy with me right now. Dawn, go ahead. Try speaking.
Kwe.
We hear you. Thank you.
Kwe, and Louise Dawn Neptune Adams. Nyan Banawebskewi. I'm Dawn Neptune Adams, and I am Penobscot. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Dawn. Greetings, I'm Adam Mazo. I am in the territory of the Massachusetts people, in a place often referred to as Boston. And I grew up in the territory of the Anishinaabe people in the Twin Cities. And I did not know those things about 7 years ago when I started on this journey making a film called Dawnland about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where I had the great honor of meeting Dawn and Chris and Jen through this work. Grateful to be with all of you right now, all over the world, and want to introduce my amazing colleague, Jennifer Kreisberg, to welcome us and offer some good medicine. So Jennifer, for those that don't know, Jen is an Emmy-nominated composer of the music for Dawnland, among many other accolades, and you were in for a treat to get to witness her perform here today. So thank you, Jen, and can I pass it over to you?
Good afternoon, at least here on the East Coast. My name is Jennifer Kreisberg. I'm Tuscarora. My mother's family is from our ancestral homeland in North Carolina. I am from a sister nation to the Wabanaki peoples. I was born and raised in Connecticut. And I believe I'm on Quinnipiac land, but I'm not 100% sure. But I apologize to the ancestors if it was someone else's land, whoever's here. I'm just really grateful to have been able to be a part of Dawnland and to be able to lend vocals and voice to sister nations. We always shared our resources pre-contact times, did a little fighting, but we traveled together, we shared resources, we shared songs, and everybody was impacted by settler colonialism. This first song is for all children impacted by genocide, before and now. One more song. This song is a really old song called the Lone Woman Song. And this is for the people of the First Light, all the Wabanaki peoples. And everybody globally. Sending this out to everybody with a lot of love. Toki toki aina taoi samna. Toki toki aina taoi samna. Toki toki aina laoi samna.
Thank you, Jen. Round of applause. Thank you, Jen, for that medicine, that music. Again, nice to be with you all. I'm Adam Mazo, director and producer of Dawnland, a film about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigating the taking of Native American children, Wabanaki children specifically, in Maine. And we want to share a little bit with you. We'll share a trailer of that film, Dawnland, and tell you a little bit more about it before we do some learning with Chris. And just before I do that, I just wanted to share a little word about how the film came about and myself, and bring you all into the conversation a little bit on Facebook, if you like. So just to, as I said, I recognize that we are all on Indigenous land, and I'm in the territory of the Massachusetts people, as I mentioned at the beginning. And feel free to share in the chat where you're located, whatever you know about that place and the people of that place, if you like. And I also want to just recognize the repeated violations of sovereignty and territory and water perpetrated by settlers like me that have impacted the original inhabitants of this land where I am for 400 years. And I extend my respect to citizens of Indigenous nations who live here today and their ancestors who have lived here for over 500 generations, and to all Indigenous people who are watching today. And I also want to affirm that this acknowledgement is insufficient, does not undo the harm that has been done and continues to be perpetrated now against Indigenous people, their land, and their water. The films that we're going to share a little bit about are about cultural survival and stolen children. And so we've witnessed it can be emotional to watch, even to watch the trailer. And we say that to those of you, especially who are Indigenous and have been involved in fostering or adoption as a child or parent. And in just a second, I'm going to ask David and Marcus to share the Dawnland trailer with you through Zoom. And I'm also sharing that link in the chat if you want to watch a little bit of a cleaner version. If you want to mute your Facebook for a minute and watch on Vimeo, you can do that too. And for now, can I ask David and Marcus to play the Dawnland trailer?
Would you like to come up to the witness stand?
They went into my home and picked up my children and placed them in a foster home.
This country had official policy to remove Native children from their homes and place them with white families so that they would learn how to be white.
But we're still here. And many of our people have never, ever shared their stories.
Imagine being torn away from your parents and community.
I remember the station wagon pulling up.
I never talked about it in therapy. I played video games.
Maine has become the first state in the nation to form a Truth and Reconciliation Commission focusing on child welfare.
The truth hurts. The truth is very painful.
How come it took so long for you all to get a group together to see if they can help us? You can't heal someone that's gone through hell.
Usually, when a truth commission happens, there's a great deal of unrest in the society that's surrounding it. And here, the dominant culture is largely unaware.
People are saying, no, this is not genocide. Genocide is what happened at Auschwitz.
The reality is, it's been the attack of our culture, it's been the attempt to remove our culture, and you replace it with nothing.
What happened to my aunts, my grandparents and all that, it's still happening.
Tell me about your employment in state child welfare.
The judges didn't figure this was anything we had to do much about.
For the longest time, I was really afraid to even say that I was Indian.
You don't take 500 years of mistrust and wash it away with one commission.
I'm not sure where we're going to be able to gain your trust.
By all intents and purposes, you represent the perpetrator.
White privilege is not something I can get rid of. I think my obligation is to harness it.
Holy Michigan.
I never would have thought the state of Maine would ever engage with the Wabanaki on this level. We see it as something very deep, a necessary transition from being an occupier to being a neighbor.
Thank you all for watching. Give a second for folks who may have clicked over to Vimeo to check out the trailer there. Thanks for watching the trailer for Dawnland. I shared in the chat a little bit more about the film, and what we're going to do here for the next little bit is we're really honored to have a couple of the folks who are integral to the creation of Dawnland be with us today. To share about the history of Wabanaki people and the contemporary reality of surviving genocide and ongoing genocide. And we're going to start with Chris Newell, who's the newly appointed executive director of the Abbe Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine, and senior partner to Wabanaki Nations, and also a senior advisor on Dawnland. So, Chris, I'll toss it over to you to share some knowledge with us.
Hi again, everybody. So yeah, I am Passamaquoddy. I grew up in the community of Monadnock in Maine, and I'm going to give you a little bit of historical overview of and the indigenous history, of colonization, as well as the creation of the U.S. government, a little bit from Native perspective, which is oftentimes when it comes to the public school system, we teach things like technology that happened during the creation of this country, or benefits that happened to certain populations. But the truth is that a lot of it came at the expense of many Native populations. It wasn't one single genocide that occurred in the United States. It was many, and it's also been continuing in various different forms. And so before we get into the present day, I just wanted to give a historical overview very briefly of how this country came to be what it is today. So let me share my screen with you here. So as I said, this is a very brief historical overview of settler colonial actions and policies with Native populations in America. And a lot of this information is very, very easy to look up. Unfortunately, our school systems are not doing the best job of keeping up with there we go. Keeping up with the changes, but there's more and more changes happening in our education system. And part of this presentation's purpose is to help those that would like to move that along, that conversation, the impacts of colonization and the U.S. government on Native populations. So just a couple of quick things. The impacts of early colonization. European contact began, in South America with the Spanish, but as well as up here in North America with the East Coast tribes beginning in the 16th century. So we're in 2020, and a lot of people focusing on the Mayflower landing from 1620, which is the 17th century. However, there was European contact with the coast prior to that. In fact, the passing of disease began prior to that as well. And it had devastating impacts, these epidemics. Reaching the shores, and then by the time of the 17th century, we had one of the most well-recorded ones, which was known as the Great Dying, which began on the east coast of what is now Maine and spread down to what is now Rhode Island, and would wipe out in 3 years, from 1616 to 1619, 3/4 of the coastal Native population. So when the Mayflower did land in 1620, this is just post that tremendously devastating epidemic. So as a result, unpopulated land that colonists began to arrive to see, especially English colonists in America, opened the way for permanent settlement by Europeans in North America in the 17th century. The most aggressive of which in America were the English, who largely privatized colonization, spurring an influx of fortune seekers to the new settlements. And oftentimes America tries to tell a story of beginning on the idea of religious freedom and things of that sort. That's part of the story, but it's actually kind of a very small part. Colonists were really here beginning with looking for the fish, and then it was the wood, then it was beaver fur, and then it was gold and other things that would come along later. Military campaigns would begin in the 17th century and expand English settlements, and later followed the Pequot War from 1636 to 1638, which was an English-led campaign to subdue and eliminate the Pequot people. So this is actually the very first attempt to wipe out a Native population here. This was, in every sense of the word, a genocide that occurred right here in where I'm at now in Connecticut. And it's oftentimes skipped over what was going on when it came to these wars. King Philip's War was another continuation of those very vast military operations. So it's a complex history that includes tribes taking sides against one another during this time due to the massive disruption of their lifeways from disease, warfare, and the power shift occurring in the homelands as a result of the impacts of colonization. When it comes to the creation of the United States and the ongoing campaign against Native populations. There are actual federal policies that we'll be talking about here, but by the time of the creation of the government in the 18th century, Native populations in the 13 English colonies, which we usually call the original colonies, vocabulary is another soft way of erasure. Tribes were decimated by disease, war, and signed agreements of peace in exchange for land, and that opened more settlement. The founding documents of the U.S. government treat natives as sovereigns in some ways, but also degrade native existence. And a great example of that is in the Declaration of Independence. Native people are referred to as merciless Indian savages. Every 4th of July, when we see readings of that document, oftentimes we hear those words repeated over and over, even in 2020. After the U.S. Constitution is ratified, promises that were made to tribes who assisted Americans in the American Revolution, the Americans would not have won without the intelligence and military help of Native tribes. All of those promises were dissolved by George Washington. As soon as the government was created, he fired a lot of the people that made those promises, and it continued with others as well. And the exploitation of vast resources west of the Mississippi would become the focus of expanding U.S. government, westward expansion to territories through official government policy eras, which required dispossessing Western tribes of land through any means necessary. And some of those policies that we see, these are actual policies of the federal government. 1790, in the beginning, it was the trade and industrial era, where there was a lot of treaty making going on between tribes in order to gain land. But the natives were seen as merely occupiers who could be displaced legally by purchase or by conquest during this period here. Next, we would follow up with what's known as the removal era. So when we talk about the Trail of Tears, this is what we're talking about. Tribes were kind of forced into negotiations at times where they were offered up land in Oklahoma in exchange for giving up their homelands, many of them walking that distance at great cost to themselves. The Reservation Era, 1850s to 1890s. This is a little misleading in that I am in Mashantucket, which is the oldest continuously occupied reservation in the country, which began in the 17th century, excuse me. And so the reservation era that we talk about here is the federal government creating reservations mostly with Western tribes, forcing tribes onto small tracts of land so settlement could happen. Then from there, reservations began to become allotted and made smaller, and there was what began as the Assimilation Era, which is where we see Indian residential schools begin, where they start taking children out of native populations and putting them into Indian residential schools in order to assimilate them into the American society. 1930s and 50s saw a short period of Indian self-rule begin. The Indian Reorganization Act is passed. However, the purpose of that was to end treaty making. And so after that law was passed, treaties are no longer made with tribes, and all dealings with tribes are done by federal law with the federal government. And then we go into another dark period, which is the termination and relocation era, where tribes were suffering not the best criteria for figuring out who was actually a tribe and who wasn't. So government trust relationships were eliminated during this period, and tribes lost their status as tribes through this time period here. And so following that, though, in the Nixon era began the self-termination era. That is when tribes began to once again regain sovereignty and regain some powers as domestic dependent nations or quasi-sovereigns dealing with the government on a government-to-government level relationship. That is a positive that we've seen, that tribes have been still fighting through all of this time. And then we see a self-governance era as we continue this going forward. However, in 2020, the executive administration, the Department of Interior, chose to end their trust relationship with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, ordering to disestablish their reservations. So in 2020, none of these policies are set in stone, and we are wondering if we are seeing the beginning of a new termination era. So Wabanaki survival and resistance. During many of these federal areas, East Coast tribes were not included in Indian policies because of the enormous impact of settler colonialism. Main tribes didn't achieve federal recognition until the self-determination era in the 70s, restoring quasi-sovereign status under federal law and can now negotiate on a government-to-government status. In 1980, an act was passed called the Main Land Claim Settlement Act, which was the largest settlement in history for 12.5 million acres with the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes in the state of Maine. Part of that included a state law called the Maine Implementing Act, which unfortunately the impact of that act has been to reverse a lot of the sovereignty that we regained when with federal recognition. And in 2020, after 40 years of dealing with the loss of power as a result of court decisions and interpretations of this law, we are in the process of trying to see what we can do to change it. And so this is an ongoing process. It does not end. People are living through it right now. And so as we talk about Wabanaki, we talk about Dawnland, we talk about child removal. There's child removal policies that the government has taken place beginning with the Indian residential schools. There's a period in the 1960s where Native people are forced into adoption. And then later on, as those policies end, we see the child welfare system start to take Native children in very, very high numbers, which led to the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was hopefully meant to stop those high numbers of Native child removals. However, that did not stop. And that's what led to the Wabanaki Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the state of Maine to examine state policy and Native child welfare and the real life impact that is happening on our communities and looking into the intergenerational trauma and trying to get to the truth of why this is happening and what it really does to people. So I'm going to end my presentation right there, and I'm going to hand it over to a good dear friend, Dawn Neptune Adams, who is going to talk a little bit about her experience. And so I don't want to segue too much into what she's going to talk to, and I'll just leave it and from here and move it on to Dawn. I think you're on mute, Dawn.
Dope. Can you hear me now? So Chris, I just want to thank you so much for that that history that was shared. It's not something that people know because in public schools they're not taught that. The oppressor's history is certainly what is taught, and we come up against that worldview consistently in activism, in politics, in everyday interactions with our neighbors and friends. So my little presentation is mostly about my personal experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I did give a statement to the commission reluctantly. It wasn't something that I was, really gung-ho about doing. I didn't really want to open that can of worms. I'm actually really glad I did. So what you're seeing right here is the first slide of my presentation, and that's my family. On the right is my mother, Pam, and two of her brothers. And this is when they were children on the reservation. It was winter, 5 below zero, and my uncle's family had sent a box of fruit from Florida. So it was a big deal to have fresh fruit in the middle of winter, and hence an occasion to take a photo. This photo was sent back to my uncle's family in Florida with a thank you card. The next slide, please. So this is a poem that I wrote in 2015. The presentation that you're seeing right now is something that I made for Native Cultures 2 class when I was at the University of Maine. It was actually the last class I took before I had to drop out of school. The recommendations from the TRC had just come out. I had read all the pages and done a whole bunch of research for this paper that I was doing for Native Cultures class. And I got really triggered and I had kind of a breakdown. I couldn't function. I had to drop out of college. There was a whole bunch of healing that had to happen. And I think I'm finally coming full circle with it. So I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it there yourself. Well, okay, I'll read it. Why not? Wabanaki languages were not lost. Wabanaki cultures were not lost. Wabanaki children were not lost. We lose our car in the farmer's market parking lot. We lose our keys down the sewer grate. We temporarily lose our minds when trying to make sense of identity and all its messy questions about belonging. What was lost was in fact stolen. Step into the circle with me, where lost and stolen are said to be found. And I added a quote there from Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was the founder of the Carlisle Indian School. I can trace a lot of the trauma in my family back to my great-grandmother who went to that school. And what he said was, kill the Indian and save the man. I was placed in a foster home that was very much of that philosophy. I had my language violently washed out of my mouth with soap and a toothbrush. I had to hold that soap in my mouth for hours. And when I finally was given permission to spit it out, the sink was full of blood. And that is how my language was stolen. Next screen, please. So this photo is my little one when she was 4 years old. In 1978, when ICWA was passed, I was 4 years old and I had just been placed in non-native foster care. Sometimes there is no tribal kin with whom a child can be placed. However, every effort should be made to ensure that the child's familial and tribal connections are maintained. When I was taken from my family, DHHS placed me in a non-native foster home miles downriver from the reservation. My mother and grandmother visited me as often as they could, but with no car, this was a hardship for them. I was 9 when my mother's parental rights were terminated, and from that day forward, I was prohibited by my foster family from going to the reservation or having contact with any tribal members, including my biological family. So one of the things my foster mother used to belittle my biological mother about was she would say that my mother would come to the foster home with a different man every time she came to visit. But that was because she and her mom didn't have a car and they were hitchhiking to come see me. My grandmother used to bring me little things that she had won at bingo. She was always trying to win dolls at the bingo hall to bring to me. Next screen. So when I was a teenager, I was introduced to this concept called a split feather. And a split feather is defined as an adult Indigenous person who was placed in non-Indigenous care as a child. I used to go to the Penobscot Nation Museum to talk to Dawn Neptune when I was a teenager. I skipped school. I would ask him, how do I find my family? How do I come back to the community? He said that I should just watch out for those who are trying to help the split feathers. And he was one of those people. This is something that I discussed at one of the talking circles that we had for the TRC. We had quite a few of them, and they were very helpful. I gotta send a shout out to Maine Wabanaki Reach, who were very much instrumental in those talking circles. Next screen, please. And there is a picture of Arnie Neptune with me and my child. He had just given us an eagle feather blessing, which meant the world to me, and I miss him very much, and I'll always be grateful for the stories and the teachings that he gifted us. Next screen, please. There we go. This is Emily Mitchell, my mother's paternal grandmother. Emily was one of 44 Penobscot children who were sent to Carlisle Indian School. I mention here that our Wabanaki ways of knowing and ways of being were replaced by that of the colonial culture in that school. Next screen, please. So a lot of times people, when they're doing question and answer at these Dawnland screenings, they ask me why I spoke, and I spoke so that this doesn't happen again. I didn't want this to happen to other Indigenous people. Next screen, please. So I'm going to read this one. This is a Facebook post that I wrote on June 14th, 2015. It says, the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes full circle today with a closing ceremony and celebration. I am grateful for everything that has come from being a part of it. For me, the process has been positive. I spent the first few days after giving my statement feeling like I was in danger of floating away. I was so much lighter. It took some time to adjust to walking with less baggage. That was true. I really felt like a big weight had come off my shoulders, and I very naively thought I was done. Turns out I wasn't. Is that my last slide? Aha. One more. So with the closing of the ceremony of the Maine Wabanaki State Truth and Reconciliation Commission on June 16th, 2015, the first part of the journey, the truth-seeking, came to an end. The statements were given by 159 people who were involved in some of the child welfare system. The TRC has released its findings and recommendations in the hopes of a new era of Wabanaki state relations marked by cooperation and mutual respect. And I'd just like to say here that the first recommendation in that reports and findings is to respect Wabanaki sovereignty. That's a struggle that we're still dealing with. And we've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Chris. I was just looking to see folks who are watching, if you have any questions, we have a little bit of time to hear questions for Dawn, for Chris, Jen. And while you're thinking of that, I wanted to ask one to all of you. You know, this vigil is about commemorating genocide and preventing genocide, and you're talking a lot about understandably about genocide that's targeted Wabanaki people, and I wonder if you have thoughts about the ways that settler colonialism has created policies of genocide that have taken the lives and destroyed families of Indigenous people, not just where you are, but across Turtle Island and around the globe. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that. We could do a whole 24 hours. We could do a whole 365 days on that, right? Anyone want to jump in about that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I mean, my presentation, as I said, was really just a slight overview. There is so much more. Forced sterilization is part of the history of Native peoples, where literally our women were hospitalized for tonsillitis and were, up to 25 or more. We don't have exact numbers, but up to 25% or more were sterilized as in those hospital visits. This is a real thing that happened only a couple of generations ago. And so when it comes to the struggle against the ongoing genocides that Native peoples are dealing with, this is an ongoing thing, and struggles for sovereignty, struggles to protect our women, from high rates of violence. All of those things are results of all of those policies and how we got to where we are now. Native people at one point were 100% of the population of this continent. And in America, we represent a little less than 2%. There's a story about how that happened. And I encourage anybody, to explore that history. It is not hidden. Unfortunately, it's been made largely invisible by the more popular narratives of history that we tend to focus upon.
Dawn, Jen, do you have thoughts? There are more questions coming in too, but do you have thoughts on this?
I guess I would encourage people to look and see what's going on now as well. Cultural genocide didn't just take place in my generation, it is ongoing, it continues today. And, we are often very much invisible. So when our sovereignty is not being respected, we have to actually shout to get people to pay attention. An example, just look what's going on with Mashpee right now. And I hope you all are going to be lighting sacred fires with them on May 3rd. Stand with Mashpee.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jen, did you want to share anything, or do you want to hear what the next question is?
No, I guess all I would say is reiterating what I did at the beginning is one of the reasons and the ways that we've gotten through all of this is sharing resources together intertribally, something we did pre-contact times, telling our own stories, telling our history from our point of view is really important, and being listened to, really important. Listen to people when they're telling you what our story is. Our people went south to north, north to south, not east to west. Colonization was east to west. Culturally, we went up and down. Just our own worldview, if you can just tweak it and listen a little bit and pivot into what we're saying, it might be easier to hear people, and it might be easier to help not perpetuate that from going on further cultural genocide, further ecocide. It's all really one thing. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And another question here, I think this is mainly for the three of you, but we'd love to hear more about your journeys collaborating each other. What was it like when Adam first showed up? How did you all, or Adam and Ben, how did you ultimately build the kind of trust necessary to create a deeply personal film and collaborate more broadly in programs like this?
I think in the timeline, this really begins with Dawn, because I came along a little later. So we'll start with Dawn.
Okay, but to be fair, Adam didn't just show up. He was there before me. I actually had to be dragged in to give a statement, and Adam and Ben were already there. But as far as my involvement with it, I didn't want any part of the movie. I'll be honest. I did not want to be in it. I didn't want to be visible. And that's a defense mechanism from my childhood. When I was, when I was invisible, I was much safer. Adam still has this way of putting people at ease, which is really, really nice. I guess my involvement with Dawnland probably wouldn't have happened without the gentle nudging from him and Ben.
Thank you.
And I'll say that my involvement as I came in, I was the senior advisor for the film for the post-production portion. So I wasn't there with Adam, Ben, and Mishi as they were making trips multiple years up to the state of Maine and building these relationships and things of that sort. And when they first approached me, just like Dawn, I had a lot of hesitancy to jumping in with non-native filmmakers about such a sensitive topic here. And I, didn't answer phone calls, all of those types of things. Adam, Ben, Mishi, all of them were persistent but polite, willing to listen, and invited me very politely to come and see an early rough cut of the film. And when I saw the footage that they had gathered, I saw relatives, friends of mine, blood relatives, people I'd grown up with my entire life, telling things to Adam that and the film crew, the entire project that, I had never seen them say in our own communities. I'd never seen them say to other people. And so that level of trust that they had gathered through a very humbling process of just going and sitting and listening and sometimes turning off the cameras when asked, which for documentary filmmakers is a very, very tough ask to do. But whenever it was asked, it happened. And it was never a question. And that level of trust that I saw from my own community members kind of laid out the path for me as far as joining and doing whatever I could to help with the storytelling and collaborating. And Adam, Ben, Mishi, the Upstander project, they've become more than just allies. Because their involvement didn't stop with the making of the film. They are still very much involved with telling Wabanaki histories and stories. And there are other film projects that have come out recently, like Dear Georgina, as we continue this story, continue the education, and continue their journey, their mission of turning bystanders into upstanders. And so it's way beyond, there's equity in the collaboration. There is something that is gained by both sides in the way that we do things. And a lot of it is by humbling ourselves and listening and joining forces where we're strongest.
Thank you, Chris. Jen, do you want to share anything about that? Or another person asked about kind of the process of the music creation and how that all went down.
So it was similar, the music creation. I was asked by the gentleman, by you. I think Chris brought me on or made the introduction or said, yeah, Jen. And
in Thailand too, I think.
In Thailand, yeah, I wasn't 100% sure of that. In Thailand, she's an awesome arts programmer, actor. And we worked collaboratively and we were able to get beyond each other's trauma. I know y'all had to deal with some of my trauma. Some of those unanswered emails are really just that, overwhelm and whatever. But we did so many different things. Some of the music were old Wabanaki songs. We were able to, because of the budget that was allotted, we were able to travel to Maine and get elders and really special community members to sing, to be recorded. We were able to compose a couple of new pieces. And yeah, it was all, none of it would have happened without the spirit of collaboration that's basically gotten us all through this to today in 2020.
Thank you, Jen. And I know we're, well, thank you all. I know we're running short on time for this hour, and I just wanted to say on my end, two things. I think one of the ways that we entered the community and entered conversations was talking about the work that we were trying to do in classrooms and with teachers and students through the Upstander project and making a teacher's guide around Coexist, our earlier film about forced reconciliation in Rwanda after the genocide there. And my colleague, Mishi Lesser, created a wonderful teacher's guide there and teacher workshops around that. And she's done the same with Dawnland and with the teacher's guide that is now out in the world focusing on all sorts of things that are both historical and current, pandemics, colonialism, and the history repeats itself. And we shared that with a lot of folks as we asked permission to film and asked to collaborate. And I think that went a long way to folks understanding that we weren't just trying to make money, but just we were trying to make a difference, trying to encourage people to aspire to be upstanders, aspire to be allies. I don't love that term because I think that's the term ally or upstander that somebody can apply to you, but I don't think that I should ever apply it to myself. So I'm honored if somebody uses that to describe me, but I don't think I should ever say I am an upstander. And I'll try to demonstrate this last one by not saying anything else. The biggest thing is just listen, elevate Wabanaki voices, elevate Indigenous voices. I don't learn anything when I talk, so just listen. And so with that, let's listen to Jennifer Kreisberg again, share some medicine with us, and then Dawn Neptune Adams will close us out with a prayer before we pass it over to our colleagues for the next hour. So thank you all.
I need to just quickly acknowledge too, Chris is just an incredible singer. I need to acknowledge that, y'all.
And we hear his voice on the soundtrack.
We hear his voice on the soundtrack and his dad's voice, who sang one of my new favorite songs in this part of my life I was introduced to.
And Jen, I'm just going to turn my video off and pass the stage to you as we close.
This is for Dawn and Chris, your kids. Adam, your kids, and my son. As it said in your presentation, Dawn, they really are the answer to our ancestors' prayers.
That was so beautiful, Jen. Thank you so much for gifting us with your music. This is a prayer that was taught to me by Arnie Neptune when I was a teenager, and I've carried it with me this whole time. Kachinues. Tanawa mane, adamane mamakiia, wichia nebawil, sapale padulia duli. Great Spirit, watch over us, guide us through our pains and sorrows, and never let us fear this life on earth. Tahoe.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, David.
Thank you for such a meaningful experience. Adam, when we first met, I mean, this whole thing just came together within a matter of days. And, you know, we talked about creating a very intentional space for this conversation. I'm so happy that we did. And I know it's a conversation for many of us that's just beginning. So thank you to all of you for giving us a window in. That way we can look within ourselves and also connect beyond as well. And so I look forward to having those conversations and inviting our community to participate in that as well. Anything that we can do to be of support. I want to learn more about the call to action that was mentioned in early May. That's new information to me. The fact that I don't know about that, that's a problem. So, you know, these are sort of information asymmetries that we have to work towards. But again, thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Chris, and Adam as well. I know we'll be in touch, I hope.